If you will, this morning, I would like to talk about the chains of sin. Sometimes I believe that we go through life um, in ignorance of the results of sin. I have noticed there's been a couple of individuals in my personal life recently that have made me aware of the chains of sin, and the consequences of choosing certain things. It can be said that decisions have consequences. But really, decisions have outcomes. Some decisions have consequences, and some decisions lead to prosperity. And it is my belief that God created us as human beings with the ability to choose. So I also think that when we are talking about uh, the devil as a roaring lion who prowls about seeking whom he can devour, we need to be aware and study the enemy. We need to be aware of the enemy's tactics. We need to understand what the results of certain decisions in our lives are. And it has come to my attention that we do have a number of young people who are in a vulnerable place in their lives right now. During the ages of from about 14 or 15 years old until the age of about 25, young people go through more changes in those 10 years than anyone will go through the rest of their lives. Okay? They are transitioning from childhood to adulthood. We call that period of time in their lives adolescence. And this lesson is not to make you feel necessarily guilty, although if you do, that may be a benefit to you if you have sin in your life to feel guilty of that sin. But more the point of this lesson is for us to be aware of the consequences when we actively choose to sin. Okay? Now, there are many sins in our lives. There are many sins that confront us. And boys may face different sins than girls face in their lives. Old people are going to face different sins. And I'll point at Kevin. And, old people are going to face different sins and different temptations than younger people do. But it is my observation over the last 20 plus years of preaching that if a person falls away from the church, or if a person chooses not to be faithful to God at all, it is going to happen in that 10-year period, most likely. I'm not saying that you can't choose to walk away from God when you're 35 or 40 or 60. But our young people from the age of 15 to 25 are at that most vulnerable stage. You could look at it. I taught a class many years ago with a number of young teenagers in that class. The number of young teenagers in that class that I taught, a lot of those young teenagers drifted away from God. They were all but one Christians at the time I taught that class. They had all committed their lives to Christ. They had all been buried with him in baptism and raised to walk in newness of life. They were all active in the church. But by the time they reached 25 years old, only a small percentage of those young people were faithful. And I've asked myself over and over, what went wrong? I believe, honestly, what actually went wrong was mostly in the homes of those individuals. I'm not trying to be judgmental on the parents, but analyzing honestly. The other part is that I don't believe that those young people actually learned the consequences of decisions that they would make in their lives. And they allowed their desires during that period of life to lead them astray. So, sin, it most often appears as something desirable. Okay? If you didn't want to sin, Satan would have very few followers. So Satan uses our inbuilt desires, our human longings, and he promises pleasure if we follow him and sin. Sin promises personal pleasure and fulfillment of those desires. That's the promise. If you will, look back. The devil entices us with illusions of satisfaction and sometimes freedom. But he takes a built-in nature that God has created in us, a built-in desire. For example, young people in the age bracket that we are talking about, there's such a thing as hormones, and they run rampant. My wife is back there smirking. She must think that I still have hormones. But those hormones create desires. God gave us hormones, and they create desires. The temptation comes with the illusion of, if we give in to things that are unlawful for us to do, unscriptural, that God has told us we are not to do, they promise satisfaction and a freedom from that desire. Look at what the Hebrew writer says in Hebrews chapter 3, verse 13. He says, but exhort one another every day, as long as it is called today, that none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. What sin does is it begins to harden us as an individual. It hardens our hearts. It hardens our minds. You know, something cracks me up sometimes. When I taught teenagers in a teenage class setting, oftentimes I would observe, and the reason I began to teach teenage classes was because previous to that, I had observed when young people got out of teenage Bible studies, they would sit in the adult class and not participate. There is one thing that drives me absolutely insane is when we cannot participate with each other in a class-like discussion setting. Because when we talk to each other, when we open up, you may be a very shy person, but when you open up, we make a connection. And we make a connection not only with each other, but we also make a connection with the scriptures that we're talking about. And it becomes more personal. My observation was this before I started teaching teen classes, was that young people would come out of a classroom setting after graduating from high school, and they would be in the adult class, and there would be absolutely zero interaction unless I, as a class teacher in that adult class, would actually drag the information out of. Sometimes I feel like I have to do that here once in a while. Our teenagers just become a little bit more shy and a little bit, I think it's that they feel vulnerable and they're afraid of giving the wrong answer. I don't care. If the answer is wrong, I don't dislike you. We're still going to work on dragging participation out. But we need to remember that we exhort each other so that we may not be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. We need to remain moldable, pliable to the will of God. Genesis chapter 3. We want to go back here. Yes, Lacey, that's a snake. Genesis chapter 3, when sin entered the world. Now, Satan is not very creative. Satan does not have an imagination. He operates on the same mode of action most of the time. Satan is allowed to work in a very limited area, and he does not very often deviate from those things. So in Genesis chapter 3 and in verse 1, you'll notice with me, now the serpent was more crafty than any other beast of the field that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, did God actually say to you, you shall not eat of any tree in the garden? Satan is stimulating what? He's stimulating communication. Satan is also stimulating a question posed to Eve. Notice Eve's response, found in verse 2. She said, we may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said, you shall not eat of the tree that is in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it lest you die, which is exactly what God said. She knew verbatim what God had told her. But the serpent said to the woman, you shall not surely die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. Some of your translations may say God's plural, in the plurality sense. So what Satan did there is he built upon a desire that was in Eve. Eve obviously knew that God was good. She also knew that God had a concept of right and wrong, good and evil. And so Satan is putting into her mind the temptation of partaking of something that God had said not to do, by making her want that very thing. She was never tempted before. She had no desire to partake of what God had told her not to until Satan entered her mind and said, don't you want to be like God? Don't you want something nice? Something good? Yes, he's crafty. Yes, he's cunning. But inventive, no. He will tempt you in the same way that he tempted Eve. Now, sin. Here's how sin works. And this is why sin is dangerous. Sin does not show its true nature up front. Rather, Satan masks the result of sin. Look back here. Here it is. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be open and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. Now, were Adam and Eve's eyes open? Absolutely. Did they then know good and evil? Absolutely. But what Satan masked was, you will not surely die. Well, they didn't die instantly, but they died eventually. Not only that, but the problem was that sin has consequences. Satan didn't tell them they would lose their home. Satan didn't tell them that they would have to deal with multiflora roses and Russian olive. Satan didn't tell them that stuff. But he built upon their desires, particularly Eve's. Sin does not show us its true nature. Rather, It builds upon a desire deep within our hearts. Sin has always promised us freedom of those desires, a fulfillment, the ability to realize what we want. But the end of sin is captivity. Satan is using those desires like we use a worm on the end of a fish hook. And then he sets the hook. And just like a fish on the end of a hook, we can wiggle and we can waggle and we can try to dislodge that hook. But it's going to be a lot harder when we realize after the hook is set what is inside that worm. It's better for us if we realize it now. Sin always begins as one of two things. One, an act of rebellion. I will never understand this. I'd like to say I didn't go through it, but I'm sure I did. But we hear the term, quote, teenage rebellion. I would rather think of that as a time period where our young people are trying to actually learn to make decisions on their own. Okay? But there are certain times where they are resistant to what mom and dad believes. And sometimes there is open rebellion. Sin begins sometimes as an act of open rebellion, whether against mom and dad or against God. It's open rebellion. But more often than not, sin is an act of indulgence. That means we want something, and we want it. Might not be something we are supposed to have or do. And we say in our minds, Satan tempts us. We say to ourselves, well, just once. Just once. I had a preacher friend of mine say one time that sin is like a mountain. And we want to climb to the top of it to see what's there. Maybe that's right. Maybe we do want to just experience it. But I'll tell you what, once we experience that, a pattern begins to form. Because Satan has found a weakness. He's found something that he uses to separate us from God, to separate us from everything that's good. And that leads to life choices. I'll tell you something here before I get into the next point. One of the individuals that I've been dealing with is actually a tenant of mine. And I thought the woman was about 10 years older than I am. She looks like an old hag. But I realized she's realized via the local news station, because of what she got into, that she's the same age I am, 43. But this woman has made a series of decisions. I don't even know where they began. I've only known her for a few years, but she has continued this pattern of behavior in making a series of bad decisions. Until about 2 weeks ago, the police officers came knocking on the door and informed her children that their mother had been arrested. When I talked to the kids, they had no idea why. They hadn't been contacted by their mother. 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Can you imagine? Where in the world are Child Protective Services at in this community? They had not been contacted by their mother or any other family member to inform them any more than that their mother was in jail. What I found out was she was arrested with her boyfriend at mile marker number 6 on the interstate with over 2 pounds of methamphetamine in the car. They were running drugs from Akron to Marietta. Now, question, was that a one-time thing? Absolutely not. That is a pattern of behavior that Satan used with a worm on a fishhook. The deceptive nature of sin is that it convinces us that we are in control. And at the same time, gradually taking control of our lives. That's the deceptiveness of sin. That is how sin works. We don't automatically put our hands out and say, handcuff me. That goes against human nature. We value freedom. We value choice. But unless the pattern is broken, sin leads to lifelong enslavement. Look with me at the Gospel of John. See what Jesus says. The Gospel of John, chapter 8, and in verse 34 of that chapter. The Gospel of John, chapter 8, and in verse 34. Jesus answered them, truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who practices sin is a slave to sin. The slave does not remain in the house forever. The Son remains forever. So if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. The great thing about what Jesus says here is, he says you don't have to be a slave forever. But he says whoever, what's he saying? Whoever practices sin is a slave. We're going to get into how we escape that slavery in a little bit. But sin is more than an addiction. Look with me at 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 19. 2 Peter chapter 2. And in verse 19, Peter says they promised them freedom, but they themselves are slaves. Did you know Satan is a slave? Satan has chosen bad over good, and he is a slave to his own self, to evil, to sin. But look at what Peter continues on. They are slaves of corruption. For whatever overcomes a person, to that he is enslaved. It is whatever we lose the ability to control in our lives, then we become a slave to it. I don't necessarily agree 100% with Alcoholics Anonymous, but one of the things that I learned from Dennis Adams was the first step in recovering from an alcoholic is this. You have to admit that you have a problem. I believe that's the first step in recovering from sin, is to admit that sin is controlling and dominating your life. Sin is spiritual enslavement, and it affects every aspect, every area of our lives, not just our spirituality. sin has a lasting effect on our ability to cope with matters of the heart. Look with me at what the Apostle Paul tells the Ephesian Christians in Ephesians chapter 4. Ephesians chapter 4 and in verse 18, the Apostle Paul says, they are darkened in their understanding. Okay, this is someone who chooses to walk in sin. Their understanding is darkened. Alienated from the life of God because of ignorance that is in them due to the hardness of their heart. You know, one of the hardest things that I've discovered in working with people, we had an individual who sat right in front of where Dawn is sitting this morning, or maybe in the pew Dawn's sitting in, I'm not sure. A few years ago, fella came in, tall fella. He came in and left the area on not good terms. Stole a car from his girlfriend, went back to Wisconsin, where he came from. I got a phone call a couple of weeks ago, maybe about 3 weeks ago. Hey, Tom, it's Big Mike. I'm like, oh no. Oh no. You know the consequences of all that? This poor guy is living homeless in Parkersburg. When he called me, he was in Williamstown. All I can see is a spiral of events based on sin and very bad decisions to sin that has left the guy literally with the clothes on his back, the shoes on his feet, and nothing else. Guess what? To earn income, to pay for a hotel room, the guy goes every 2 or 3 days and gives plasma because they give him a stipend of $45 to $50 every time he gives plasma. And that helps to pay for his hotel room. Now, you and I oftentimes take for granted what we have. But I'll tell you what, it's one bad decision, one fish hook. Our lives are one fish hook away from living homeless in Parkersburg with the clothes on our back. The question is, are we going to give in the first time to that fish hook lure? Or are we going to realize sin for what it is? Our lives are going to be so much better if we realize it for what it is. I'm not saying the pattern can't be broken. We're going to look at that. The pattern can be broken, but it's so much easier if we don't go down that road to begin with. Because what happens is sin deadens the conscience. And suddenly we don't realize it's wrong because we've done it. Once we have committed sin, once we've transgressed God's law, it is so much easier to do it the second time, and the third time, and the fourth time, and the fifth time. Once you've rationalized something in your mind once, it just continues. The Apostle Paul, in his first letter to Timothy, chapter 4, and in verse 2, says this, through the insincerity of liars, those whose conscience are seared. Paul says it is possible for one to sear. That means to burn. When we burn something, it deadens the nerve endings. Ever burnt your finger? I have. Burned my finger one time, and I can't feel the tip of my finger for a long time after that finger has been burned. Why? Because I killed the nerves. What Paul says is we are capable of burning our heart so that we no longer feel. We no longer feel guilt, pain. We no longer can anticipate right from wrong. All of this is happening while we are being separated more and more from everything that is good, until eventually there's nothing left. I don't know what the suicide rate in our county is. I was talking to a sheriff's deputy the other day. You know, they don't report suicides as suicides anymore. We have so many suicide deaths in Washington County, Ohio, that they no longer report them as suicides. They're reported as, quote, accidental deaths. Why do we have such a high suicide rate? Because people put themselves in positions where they finally cannot see a way out. A couple of weeks ago, we announced a young man, 23 years old, in this community that committed suicide. 23 years old. There's nothing you can do at 23 that you can't get out of by the time you're 30. And yet, somehow, these people feel so trapped. And again, we're looking at the age range 15 to 25. 2 years ago, I did 2 funerals for 2 young men, 30 days apart, 21 years old, both died from suicide. They're in the age range 15 to 25. The result of a series of bad decisions based on sin, and Satan hooked them. Romans chapter 6, verse 16. Do you not know that if you present yourselves to anyone as obedient slaves, you are slaves to the one whom you obey, either of sin, which leads to death, or of obedience, which leads to righteousness? Present yourself. You're either going to serve God or Satan. There's no middle ground, my friends. Good and evil. There's no gray area. Again, I want to emphasize, it's more than an addiction. Sin may initially feel like freedom because it allows us, and I put myself in this category, it allows us to indulge in our lust. Lust is simply desires. It allows us to have something that we want without restriction. But this isn't freedom. The feeling that you have when you get that is short-lived. It one time was described to me as just the same way drugs work. Sin works the same way drugs work. And my friend Caleb Smith, who's a sheriff's deputy, says this. Caleb says it's like chasing the dragon. Once you start drugs, you feel that rush of adrenaline, that high. The first time. You'll never feel it the second time. He said the reason we have drug overdoses in this county is because people are chasing that dragon. They want to feel that rush the second time. So they take more drugs and more drugs and more drugs until they overdose. And they never get the same feeling. There's never a feeling like the first time. Remember that. there will never be that adrenaline rush the second time. That feeling is short-lived, whether it's a feeling of freedom or a feeling of ecstasy. Eventually, the consequences of our choices of sin will take its toll. Sometimes faster than others, sometimes it will be slower than others. But eventually, those decisions will take its toll in broken relationships, shattered homes, personal guilt, the feeling of shame, and most importantly, a separation from all that is good, a separation from God and God's family. James 1 verse 15 says, "Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death." Your true freedom, not the freedom of sin, the true freedom is not found in doing what we want or desire, but it is found in living according to God's design. He created us. God created us. And He created us in a way in which, if we live a certain way, we will find the freedom. We will find joy. We will find the thrill. You've heard the saying, life is good. And life is good. Life is not all doom and destruction. Jesus has designed things so that we can have a good life. Galatians, the Apostle Paul in Galatians chapter 5, verse 13 says, "For you were once called to freedom, brothers. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another." Satisfaction. Satisfaction comes from doing what God designed humans to do. It's only when we become self-centered and do what we want to do that misery prevails. Sin may bind us with unseen chains, but Jesus has a key. He has a key to unlock those chains and to make us truly free. Look back with me again at the Gospel of John, chapter 8. And see what Jesus says. The Gospel of John, chapter 8, verse 36. "So if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. I know that you are offspring of Abraham, yet you seek to kill me, because my word finds no place in you. I speak what I have seen with my Father, and I have heard from your Father." Jesus said, He sets us free. Back up a little bit. So Jesus told the Jews who believed in Him, "If you would abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free." Truth is freedom. Jesus' words are truth. They unbind us from things that hold us because they expose Satan's schemes. Jesus is not a license to sin freely without consequence, but rather Jesus sets a pattern of a life that will give us joy, fulfillment, and freedom. In Romans chapter 6, the Apostle Paul builds upon this, and he explains what it means to experience this kind of life. Romans chapter 6, verse 6. "We know that our old self was crucified with Him in order that the body of sin might be brought to nothing." Wait a minute, wait a minute. What this means is there's a fresh start. There is a fresh start for all of us. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. We know that our old self was crucified with him in order that the body of sin might be brought to nothing, so that we would no longer be enslaved to sin. For one who has died has been set free from sin. Now, if we have died with Christ, we believe that we will also live with him. We know that Christ, being raised from the dead, will never die again. Death no longer has dominion over him. For the death he died to sin once. But the life he lives to God. The Apostle Paul would tell us to set our affections on things above, rather than things on the earth. We are warned multiple times throughout the Scriptures, once we've been washed with the blood of Christ, not to entangle ourselves again in the bondage of sin. The Apostle Paul in Galatians chapter 5 and in verse 1 gives us one of these passages. Galatians chapter 5 and verse 1, Paul says, "For freedom Christ has set us free. Stand therefore and do not submit again to the yoke of slavery." Doesn't mean we won't be tempted, but it does mean with the temptation there will be a way of escape. In conclusion, God created you and me as free individuals, free moral agents, we like to say, meaning that we choose who and what we serve and how we live our lives. Isn't that nice? God doesn't hold us hostage. He allows us to choose. God didn't create us as robots, enslaved to him forever, but rather he created us as free individuals. In Gospel of John chapter 7, verse 17, Jesus says this. He says, "If anyone's will is to do God's will, he will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I am speaking on my own authority." Jesus said if our desire is to do God's will, he will speak to us. We'll be able to discern what God's will is. We'll be able to discern whether Jesus is real. That's part of being free, to make a choice. God has given everyone opportunity to choose. And each day we face choices. I face them, you face them, we all face choices. Every day. Multiple times a day. Some choices are easy, and some are more difficult. 2 Peter chapter 3, and in verse 9, the Apostle Peter says, "The Lord is not slow to fulfill his promise, as some count slowness, but is patient towards you." Wait, well, what promise? Friends, it's the promise of his returning. God is not slow in returning to the earth. No. Peter says, here's the point. He says, God is patient towards you, not wishing that any should perish, but that all should reach repentance. See, God is waiting. He's waiting for every person who will ever become a Christian to become a Christian. He's waiting for every person who is lost in sin to get out of sin. I believe the day will come when there'll be no more people who will accept Jesus as the answer to the problems, and Jesus will return. There will be a day where we will stand before the judgment seat of Christ and give an account for the choices that we've made. The Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 6 says this, are we to continue in sin that grace may abound? Your King James Version will say, God forbid. May God forbid us to continue in sin that grace may abound. How can we who are dead to sin still live in it? The Hebrew writer says that for a Christian to fall back into sin, he says they crucify again the Son of God to their own destruction. What does it mean to crucify Jesus all over again? That means to say, I don't care that you died for me, Jesus. It's to say, I don't care that you bled on the cross. It's to say that I don't care that somebody nailed your hands to a tree. That's what it's doing when we continue in sin. It's like saying that. So young people, this morning I hope you understand how sin works. Just remember a fish hook. Once Satan has set that hook in the mouth of you, his fish, he has got you on the line. But Jesus has given you a way to break that line. He's given you an opportunity to turn to him and to become his child. You'll take out your songbook and turn to the song that's been selected this morning. If there's anyone here this morning with any needs, and at any time, you don't have to wait for Sunday or Wednesday or any time that we need to help someone. We're not perfect. None of us are. And from time to time, we all need lifted out of the muck. That's part of being human. So if there's ever a need, please don't hesitate. There's opportunity this morning as we stand